Most people thought they knew Barack Obama's story. Father from Kenya, mother from Kansas. Two worlds meeting in one man. A symbol. America understood, or thought it did. But when DNA researchers began examining his family lines in detail, the data pointed somewhere else entirely. Not to a scandal, not to a secret, but to a history so much older and more layered than the official story that it reframes everything. Here is what the science found. Start with the number that changed the conversation. According to genealogical researchers working with genetic databases and historical records, Barack Obama is approximately 50% African by DNA, but not entirely in the way the public assumed. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was Luo, one of Kenya's major ethnic groups, Nilotic in origin, meaning their genetic roots trace not to the Bantu migrations of Central Africa, but to ancient populations from the Nile Valley corridor. That paternal Y chromosome haplogroup, E1b1b, is estimated to have originated 22,000 to 26,000 years ago in northeastern Africa, in the region of present-day Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. From that origin point, the haplogroup spread in two directions. One branch moved south into the Great Rift Valley, ancestral to the Nilotic and Cushitic populations of East Africa, including, ultimately, the Luo. The other branch moved north, into the Levant, into the Mediterranean basin, into Europe. Today, E1b1b appears in significant concentrations among Berber North Africans, Somali, Ethiopian, Greek, Italian, and Ashkenazi Jewish populations. That's not a side note. That's the genetic record showing that the Luo of Kenya and populations that seeded ancient Mediterranean civilizations share the same deep ancestral origin. When researchers mapped Obama's paternal haplogroup against global population distributions, the lineage that emerged was one of humanity's oldest and most widely traveled. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what haplogroups actually are. A haplogroup is not an ethnicity. It's not a culture, a language, or an identity. It's a genetic signature, a set of inherited markers on the Y chromosome that gets passed from father to son, essentially unchanged, across thousands of generations. It's one of the most reliable tools population geneticists have for tracing ancient human migration. And what E1b1b tells us is that Obama's paternal ancestors, going back far enough, were part of one of the most consequential population movements in human prehistory. A founding group that emerged in northeastern Africa tens of thousands of years before the first Egyptian pyramid, before the first Mesopotamian city, before any civilization the history books describe. A group whose descendants eventually helped populate 3 continents. Dr. Spencer Wells, who spent years directing the National Geographic Genographic Project, one of the largest human ancestry mapping efforts ever undertaken, described this class of finding as one of the most consistent surprises in his field. People expect African DNA to be geographically isolated from the rest of the world's story. But Africa is where every human story begins. The haplogroups that define European and Middle Eastern populations didn't appear out of nowhere. They emerged in Africa and migrated outward. When you trace a Kenyan paternal line back far enough, you're not finding a separate branch of humanity. You're finding the trunk. The Luo people themselves have a migration history that reflects this. Oral traditions and historical records describe the Luo moving south from a region near the Nile into the Great Lakes area of East Africa over several centuries. They were not originally from Kenya in the way that word usually implies. They arrived, as most peoples did, through movement, following water, land, and necessity. Their genetic signature had been moving for far longer than their oral history remembers. To put it in concrete terms, the same haplogroup branch that eventually produced the Luo of Western Kenya also produced, through a different migration route, populations that settled the Nile Delta, crossed into the Sinai, moved through the Levant, and eventually contributed to the gene pools of populations in Greece, southern Italy, and the ancient Near East. This is not metaphor. This is what the chromosome data shows when it is mapped against archaeological evidence of ancient population movement. The people who built early medieval civilizations and the people who became Barack Obama Sr.'s ancestors shared a founding population, separated not by race or origin, but by the direction they walked tens of thousands of years ago. That context changes how you read every other part of this story. Now the maternal line, and this is where the story gets genuinely unexpected. Anne Dunham's family had described themselves for generations as English and Irish, standard white American ancestry. But when genealogists began running DNA analysis on the maternal line, the mitochondrial markers, which trace the unbroken mother-to-child line back across centuries, pointed to sub-Saharan Africa, specifically to populations consistent with the Mende people of West Africa, in the region of present-day Sierra Leone. The evidence placed this African ancestor in the era of American slavery. The Dunham family had roots in Maryland and Virginia before migrating west to Kansas. Those states had significant enslaved populations in the 18th and 19th centuries. Genealogists identified what they describe as a probable point of ancestry erasure, a generation where the paper records go quiet, and a black ancestor's identity disappears into a white family line. It happened thousands of times across American history. Children of mixed parentage were recorded as white. The African line was buried, and it stayed buried until DNA began finding it again. This is not a fringe phenomenon. Genetic genealogist Gina Page, working with the African Ancestry Project, has spent years recovering exactly these kinds of buried lineages from American families who believed themselves to be entirely of European descent. The pattern she describes is remarkably consistent. A family migrates west, from Virginia to Kentucky, from Kentucky to Kansas, from Kansas further still. With each move, the family reinvents itself slightly. Old records don't follow them. Neighbors don't know their history. And over 2 or 3 generations, an ancestor who appeared in no official document as black simply disappears into the whiteness of the frontier. The DNA, however, doesn't reinvent itself. It carries the original record forward, invisible to census takers and invisible to the family itself, until a laboratory finally reads it. For Anne Dunham's family, the mitochondrial evidence pointed back to a woman, unnamed, unrecorded, whose West African genetic signature survived in her descendants' cells for generations after every other trace of her existence had been erased from the written record. She was a real person. She lived somewhere in Virginia or Maryland during the 18th or 19th century. Her name is unknown. Her story is unknown. But she is genetically present in the 44th President of the United States. It's worth pausing on what that means practically. Mitochondrial DNA is extraordinarily stable. It doesn't recombine with paternal DNA the way the rest of the genome does. It passes from a mother to all of her children, sons and daughters alike, essentially intact. When a laboratory identifies a mitochondrial haplogroup in a living person, they are reading a genetic letter that was written by a woman who lived centuries ago and has been copied faithfully ever since. The unnamed West African woman in Anne Dunham's family tree didn't just influence Barack Obama's ancestry in an abstract historical sense. Her mitochondrial sequence, her specific personal genetic signature, is physically present in every cell of his body. That's what the science means when it says she is there. The Mende people of Sierra Leone, with whom that mitochondrial signature is most closely associated, have one of the richer documented histories in West Africa. They are an agricultural people with a tradition of governance, craftsmanship, and trade that predates European contact. Their genetic markers have been cataloged in detail, partly because of the African Ancestry Project's work with the diaspora community, connecting African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans to their specific regional origins on the continent. When researchers identified the Mende connection in Obama's maternal line, they weren't pointing to a vague continental origin. They were pointing to a specific population, a specific region, and a specific cultural heritage that was carried across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships and survived in American DNA long after it was buried in American records. Then came the more specific claim. In 2012, Ancestry.com researchers announced they had identified a probable connection between Obama's maternal line and John Punch, the first person of African descent legally sentenced to lifetime enslavement in colonial America. Punch appears in Virginia court records from 1640. The genetic link, researchers said, ran through Anne Dunham's white Virginia ancestry, a family line that had carried African DNA across generations without ever acknowledging it. The finding was disputed. Critics argued the connection was inferential, not confirmed. DNA evidence of this kind points to probability, not certainty. Without direct samples from Punch's documented descendants, the chain can't be closed. But the methodology, tracing African ancestry through white family lines using combined paper and genetic evidence, is standard practice in genetic genealogy. A contested finding is not a refuted one. John Punch himself is a figure whose historical significance has long outpaced his public recognition. He was an indentured servant of African descent in colonial Virginia, who, in 1640, attempted to escape alongside 2 European servants. All 3 were captured. The 2 Europeans received extended indentures as punishment. Punch alone was sentenced to servitude for the rest of his natural life. Historians point to that court record as the first documented legal distinction between black and white bondage in the English colonies, the moment the system that would become American racial slavery began to crystallize in law. Before that ruling, the distinction between indentured servitude and permanent enslavement was not cleanly drawn along racial lines. People of African descent had served indentures and, in some documented cases, gone on to own land and even servants themselves. John Punch's sentence changed that. It established, in legal precedent, that a person of African descent could be treated differently under the law, sentenced to a lifetime of bondage that their white counterparts did not face for the same offense. Legal historians who have studied the Virginia colony's court records describe the Punch ruling as one of the foundational documents of American racial hierarchy. Not because it was loudly proclaimed, but because it was quietly repeated, built upon, and eventually codified into the slave codes that defined American law for the next 2 centuries. If the genetic connection holds, then the man who would become America's first black president carried in his maternal DNA a direct line to the man whose enslavement helped establish the legal architecture of American racism. The first black president descended from the first legally enslaved black man in American history, 2 endpoints of the same ORC, separated by nearly 4 centuries. The Ancestry.com researchers were careful in their language. They used words like probable and suggests. They acknowledged the limits of the methodology, but they also noted that the convergence of paper trail evidence and genetic markers, multiple independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same conclusion, was not something that could be easily dismissed. In genetic genealogy, when the DNA and the documents agree, researchers treat that as meaningful, even when the chain isn't fully closed. What does this all mean when you step back? On the surface, Obama's story was about 2 worlds meeting, Kansas and Kenya, black and white, American and African. But the DNA tells a different story. The paternal line doesn't just go to Kenya, it goes to one of humanity's oldest migration corridors, connecting East African Nilotic populations to the same ancestral stock that eventually shaped civilizations across the ancient Mediterranean. The maternal line doesn't just go to Kansas. It goes back through centuries of American silence to an enslaved African woman whose identity was erased from the written record and only survived in the genetic code. And at the deepest level of the paternal tree, the haplogroup that marks Obama's Y chromosome, E1B1B, is the same haplogroup found in elevated frequencies among populations that helped define the ancient world. The Berbers of North Africa, who predated the Arab conquest of the Maghreb by thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians, whose genetic legacy has been partially reconstructed from mummy remains. The populations of the southern Mediterranean, who built the civilizations that Western culture claims as its own inheritance. All of them carry branches of the same haplogroup that traces back to the same northeastern African origin, the same origin that connects, tens of thousands of years back, to the Luo of Kenya. Consider what that means for the way the world has typically categorized race and ancestry. The popular understanding of human genetic history treats Africa and Europe as separate stories. One the origin of the Black experience, one the origin of the white experience, each running on parallel tracks until they were forced together by conquest and slavery. But the chromosome data doesn't support that picture. It shows that the tracks were never parallel. They diverged from the same point, spread across the world in different directions, built different languages and cultures and physical appearances, and then were brought back into contact, sometimes violently, by the movements of recorded history. The separation was real, but it was never as deep or as absolute as the categories imposed on it. Barack Obama's genome is one data point in a much larger picture that population geneticists have been assembling for decades. But it is a remarkably illustrative data point because the specific findings in his case hit so many of the major themes that characterize human genetic history. Ancient African migrations that predate civilization, the erasure of ancestry through racial hierarchy, the survival of genetic memory long after cultural memory has been destroyed, and the way that science, given enough time, tends to recover what history tried to bury. The story wasn't two worlds colliding. It was one very old human story, folded across thousands of years, surfacing again in one man at one moment in history. America told itself a story about Barack Obama that was really about America, about division and unity, about race and progress, about where the country had been and where it was going. And that story was true as far as it went. But the DNA goes further. It goes past the founding of the Republic, past the arrival of the first enslaved Africans, past the Norman conquests and the Roman Empire and the first cities of the Fertile Crescent, all the way back to a population of human beings living in northeastern Africa more than 20,000 years ago, who had no idea that their descendants would one day stand in separate corners of the earth and be told they had nothing in common. The records concealed it, the genetics revealed it, and the story that emerged was not simpler than the one the world already knew. It was infinitely older,